When you talk about classic movies, you tend to talk about films that influenced American culture. You talk about The Godfather, you talk about Star Wars, you talk about Indiana Jones, Jaws, Jurassic Park, Back to the Future. Movies that defined a generation. When I was in film school, we talked about these movies all the time. For a movie that had so much influence on such a specific time and place in American culture, I almost never hear anyone talk about American Graffiti. In fact, the first time I ever heard of the film was when George Lucas briefly mentioned it during an interview with Leonard Maltin, while he was discussing Star Wars.
Al Nye Jr. said, "I'm interested." He said, "I don't understand this, but I loved American Graffiti, and whatever you do is okay with me."
Is that why so many people neglect to talk about it? Was Star Wars such a big hit that it overshadowed Graffiti's influence? After all, it was even nominated for a Best Picture Oscar in 1974. I guess when you make something as popular as the world's greatest space opera, your earlier works can get lost in the shuffle. But I also think that American Graffiti speaks to a specific audience. Unlike that galaxy far, far away, Graffiti is set during a specific time period. It isn't timeless. It's a time capsule that seems to speak to those who experienced that time period. At least, that's what I thought when I first viewed the film. This is a movie I would have loved had I lived in the 60s. It's a coming-of-age film documenting the cruising rock and roll culture of that time. It follows a group of high school friends spending their last night together before they all move on to college. It was quite a leap for Lucas, whose last film, THX 1138, was set in a harsh, bleak utopia. Although the film's music and scenery cements it as a contemporary period piece, the more I watch it, the more I realize that it more or less represents a lot of the things I felt and did after high school. I remember cruising the streets of Gratiot with friends, unsuccessfully trying to pick up girls.
Yeah.
What?
Give her $5. She said give her $5, she'll flash. Yeah.
Yeah, pass us $5, man.
Oh, they need $5 for something.
I also remember feeling a lot like Richard Dreyfuss's character, Kurt, not sure what to do with my life, feeling intimidated and pressured into choosing a direction before I even knew what I wanted to do. In many ways, American Graffiti is all about making choices and allowing those choices to define us in a way that pushes us out of our comfort zone.
Now, you got three choices. One, you chicken out. In that case, I let ants tie you to the car and drag you around a little bit, and you don't want that, right?
No.
Graffiti had an unusual structure for its time. The characters, Kurt, Steve, Milner, Terry the Toad, and Laurie, all go their separate ways at the start of the movie, so the film constantly switches between characters as they go on their own adventures. Once in a while, the characters will regroup to let each other know how their night's going, but then they split up again. It was one of the first ensemble movies. Today, it's not so uncommon for a movie to split up its characters, but back then the concept was so fresh and different that most of the studios in Hollywood rejected Lucas's story treatment. They couldn't wrap their heads around the concept. Separate stories that are interwoven throughout a single film? That's preposterous. Universal actually considered releasing the film as a TV movie at one point. That was until Coppola's The Godfather was released, and then suddenly Universal was singing a different tune.
I don't like that surfing shit. Rock and roll's been going downhill ever since Buddy Holly died.
This is one of those movies that feels more significant the older I get. It's also about that feeling of nostalgia, being able to look back at a specific time in our lives and reminiscing about how different things were. I actually have terabytes of footage I shot when I was in high school. It isn't professional enough to turn into a feature film, but once in a while I get a kick at looking back on that period in my life.
You just can't stay 17 forever.
American Graffiti is simply a love letter to everyone who lived through that time period, but the characters are relatable to anyone. Going back to Kurt Henderson, played by Richard Dreyfuss, Kurt's getting ready to head out east to college on a $2,000 scholarship. From the start, he's unsure of himself, despite getting pep talks from his friends. I find myself following Kurt's character the closest because he's the one that probably has to make the hardest decision. He starts out his night driving around with Steve and his girlfriend Laurie, played by Ron Howard and Cindy Williams. At one point, Kurt sees this mysterious blonde woman, played by Suzanne Summers, who makes a pass at him from her car, and he spends the rest of the night trying to find her.
I just saw a vision. I saw a goddess. Come on, you gotta catch up to her.
It's been argued that the girl never existed, that she's simply a figment of Kurt's imagination, and she resembles any sort of excuse for Kurt to stay at home, which is what he really wants to do. The rest of the night, Kurt goes on other adventures, like going on a brief date with an old flame and hanging out with a gang calling themselves the Pharaohs.
Toby Juarez, he's a pharaoh, isn't he?
Toby Juarez?
Yeah.
Sure, we know Toby. We killed him last night.
But his overall mission stays the same. He's got to find this mystery woman. Kurt is all about that indecisive person in all of us, the one faced with a really hard choice and who leans more toward the easier decision despite knowing deep inside that we need to take that all-important first step.
If the Wolfman was here, he'd say, get your ass in gear.
The polar opposite of Kurt is Steve Bolander, played by Ron Howard. Steve has already made up his mind about going to college and is so confident that he ends up loaning his Chevrolet Impala to his buddy Terry the Toad. He also breaks the news to his longtime girlfriend Lori that he wants to date other people while they're apart, which sets up the tension between them throughout the rest of the film. Steve's and Lori's story is the heart of the movie because I think most of us have been there before, making a decision to leave behind a loved one in order to achieve our goals. At first, Lori goes along with it, but she doesn't hide it well.
What's wrong?
Go to hell.
They spend their night reminiscing about the origin of the relationship, and it becomes clear that Lori is more sentimental than Steve. When they finally break it off for good, Steve realizes how hard it's going to be to live without her, and he goes after her. By the end of the film, it's interesting how Steve and Kurt switch roles. Unlike Kurt, who anchors himself to something he can't have, Steve has something concrete to latch onto.
Stephen, please don't leave me. Don't leave me,
I won't.
Then there's the pretty boy, John Milner, played by Paul Le Mat, who would later go on to star in Puppet Master. Yeah, he went from having a prominent role in a George Lucas film to having a prominent role in a Charles Band film. Milner's the token hot rod, the one we all looked up to in high school. He was the guy who spent most of his time standing in front of his car in the school parking lot, checking out women and combing his hair a zillion times.
What's your name?
My name? Mud. If anybody sees you.
Milner's the rock star with a heart of gold. Although he spends the beginning of the film trying to pick up women on the streets of Modesto, his night changes when he gets stuck with a bratty 12-year-old, Carol, who seeks attention. It's uncomfortable at first because it feels like Carol is trying to come on to Milner, but Milner keeps his distance, and eventually the two form a playful bond that culminates in the two of them vandalizing a car with shaving cream as they deflate the car's tires. Milner's all about having fun, but on this night, it's just with the most unexpected person. It's a fun story, but it's also kind of sad. Carol reveals that her parents and her older sister constantly write her off, which is how she ends up with Milner in the first place. She also keeps referring to herself as ugly, which is mean, but also relatable.
Your car's uglier than I am. That didn't come out right.
How many of us are actually secure about our appearance at such a young age? Milner goes from being an annoyed babysitter to a caring big brother, and by the end of their story arc, you want to see them become friends.
Gee, thanks. It's just like a ring or something. It's like we were going steady.
Probably the strangest part of the film follows Terry the Toad Fields, played by Charles Martin Smith, the typical nerd, always unsuccessful with girls due to his thick-rimmed glasses, his dorky appearance, and his lack of a cool muscle car. When we're first introduced to the character, he loses control of his moped, crashing it into a building. Interesting to note, when they filmed this scene, the actor actually lost control of the vehicle, and Lucas decided it looked so authentic he just kept it in the movie. And he doesn't even break character when he approaches Ron Howard. The two just acknowledge that it happened and the scene goes on. I especially love the look on Howard's face as he looks away like, what the hell just happened? I mentioned earlier that Steve gives Toad his car to look after. And naturally, what does Toad do as soon as Steve hands him the keys? He acts like he owns it. Of course, he spends the first part of his night being ridiculed by the kids who recognize him.
Is that you in that beautiful car? Jeez, what a waste of machinery.
Until he picks up Debbie, played by Candy Clark, a spontaneous woman just looking for a good time. Debbie is that mystery woman who brings out the adventure in all of us. Terry's so entranced by her that he makes up this whole backstory to impress her. When she tricks him into getting them some booze, Terry first tries the whole I forgot my ID thing, which doesn't work. He then gets some random guy to buy the booze for him. The next thing we know, the guy's tossing Terry a bottle of alcohol as the shop owner chases him out with a gun. Then Steve's car gets stolen. Then when they find the car, Terry gets beaten up by the thieves. This whole segment could have been the inspiration for the movie License to Drive. Toad's story is another fun segment and reminds me of a time when I was off getting into some mild trouble, maybe finding myself in a situation I wouldn't ordinarily get into by myself.
You know, Terry, I had a pretty good time tonight.
This was also one of Harrison Ford's earliest roles, playing outlaw street racer Bob Felfa, who spends his limited screen time seeking out Milner so they can race.
Hey, nobody could beat him, man. He's got the fastest...
I ain't nobody, dork.
He's a minor character, but toward the end of the film, he ends up picking up Lori, which results in her reuniting with Steve at the film's climax. There's one other character I haven't mentioned, and that's the film's soundtrack. Back then, it was common for movies to have traditional musical scores. American Graffiti marks one of the first films where licensed music played a big part in the soundtrack. In fact, they spent so much of the film's budget on licensing the songs that they couldn't afford a composer. Lucas would actually write scenes to specific songs, which eventually ended up in the movie. Today, it's more common to have popular music play in movies, and sometimes it's cliché, but back then, this was a new thing, helping to make it stand out in the crowd. Another thing that permeates throughout the film is disc jockey Wolfman Jack, who's heard playing on the radio at different intervals throughout the film. It adds to that classic 60s feeling, reminding me of something like Grand Theft Auto, where the different radio ads play as you control the character, enhancing the feeling of a real environment. Wolfman Jack plays an integral role later in the film, and the scene between him and Richard Dreyfuss is sometimes noted as being one of the most heartfelt scenes in cinema. There's something about American Graffiti that resonates to this day. Its scenery and music may reflect a certain time, but the issues the characters deal with ring true to this day. Lucas crafted a film that speaks to generations, if not visually, then certainly thematically. It was Lucas's groundbreaking, somewhat gritty futuristic vision, blended with American Graffiti's warmth and compassion, that seeped into the making of Lucas's next film.